Forget everything Hollywood taught you about Dracula. The pale, romantic vampire who stalks candlelit castles is a fantasy. The real man who inspired the legend was far more terrifying than fiction. A prince who ruled with iron and blood, who turned impalement into an art form, and whose thirst for power drenched his homeland in horror. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia. History remembers him as Vlad Vlad the Impaler. The 15th century was not kind to Eastern Europe. It was a land crushed between empires, the Christian kingdoms of the West and the unstoppable Ottoman Turks of the East. Wallachia, a narrow strip of land between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, was caught in the middle, too small to fight both sides, too proud to kneel. In this deadly crossroads, Vlad was born, not into safety, but into violence. His father, Vlad II, was a noble of the Order of the Dragon, a secret Christian brotherhood sworn to defend Europe against the Turks. The order's emblem was a dragon biting its own tail, symbolizing eternal vigilance. To prove his loyalty, Vlad II sent his two young sons, Vlad and Radu, to the Ottoman court as hostages. It was supposed to guarantee peace. But for the young prince, it became a school in cruelty. In the gilded halls of Edirne, the Ottomans taught him the language, customs, and tactics of empire, but they also taught him fear. As a hostage, his life depended on his father's obedience. When Wallachia rebelled, the boy was beaten, humiliated, and threatened with death. He saw men flayed alive, stakes driven through their bodies while they screamed. The Turks used impalement as punishment, and Vlad watched, learning not just how it was done, but how it broke the soul. Years later, when he finally returned home to claim his father's throne, he brought that lesson with him. Wallachia was in chaos, its nobles treacherous, its neighbors hostile, its people starving. The Ottoman Empire demanded tribute. The Hungarian crown demanded loyalty. And somewhere between those two powers stood a young prince with nothing left but rage. Vlad swore he would make his land strong again, not through mercy, but through terror. He would rule so brutally that even the thought of rebellion would die in the hearts of his enemies. And he began with those closest to him. The boyars, the noble lords who had betrayed his father, were invited to a grand Easter feast at Vlad's court. They came dressed in silk, bearing gifts, relieved to see their new ruler smiling. Vlad welcomed them warmly, raised a cup, and toasted the glory of Wallachia. Then, as the music played, his soldiers sealed the doors. Vlad stood and calmly ordered every nobleman over the age of 12 impaled on the spot. Their wives and children were forced to watch. The youngest and healthiest were spared, only to be marched to the mountains and worked to death rebuilding his ruined fortress at Poenary. By nightfall, the boyars' corpses lined the road to the castle like a forest of flesh and wood. It was the beginning of a reign that would become one of the most terrifying in medieval history. The chronicles call it a reign of stakes. Villages of corpses, entire armies impaled in neat, gruesome rows, each body a message, each scream a warning. To the Turks, to traitors, to thieves, to the poor, to anyone who crossed him. Vlad ruled through fear, so absolute that even the dead seemed to serve him. His enemies called him a monster. His people called him a savior. Because behind the horror lay a strange, twisted logic. Every execution, every stake, every pile of corpses had a purpose. In a land devoured by war and greed, Vlad believed only terror could bring peace. Vlad's legend truly began when he turned fear itself into a weapon. He understood something few rulers did, that terror could travel faster than any army. His rule wasn't just about killing. It was about performance. Every impalement, every mutilation, every act of cruelty was part of a theater of dread designed to make enemies tremble before they ever reached his borders. He ruled from his fortress at Targovist, a grim citadel of stone surrounded by forests and mist. Travelers who approached it reported silence, so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then, as they neared the gates, they saw them. Thousands of impaled bodies lining the roads like a grotesque procession. Men, women, soldiers, thieves, envoys, some already rotted to bone, others still twitching. The sight was so overwhelming that even seasoned mercenaries turned pale. One chronicler wrote that the stench alone could kill a man. But Vlad didn't just display corpses. He staged them. Some hung upright, others upside down. Some were arranged in spirals, some in rings around his castle walls. A few were positioned around tables, as if attending an eternal feast. And when the wind blew through that grim forest, it made the stakes creak, a chorus of death that could be heard for miles. The message was simple. This is what happens to those who defy me. When thieves were caught, he didn't imprison them. He impaled them in the town square, their bodies left to rot as reminders of divine justice. When envoys insulted him, he punished them in ways that mocked their arrogance. Ottoman diplomats once refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom. Vlad ordered the turbans nailed to their skulls so they'd never have to take them off again. To his enemies, these stories painted him as a demon. But to his people, peasants brutalized by endless wars and noble corruption, Vlad was something else, a necessary evil. He brought order where chaos had reigned. He punished the rich who stole from the poor. He executed corrupt officials and rewarded loyalty with protection. It was said you could leave a bag of gold in the road and no one would dare touch it. Still, nothing could prepare the world for what he did in 1462. That year, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who conquered Constantinople, invaded Wallachia with an army of over 100,000 men. Vlad's own forces numbered barely a tenth of that. But he didn't fight like a soldier. He fought like a ghost. He waged war through deception, fire, and nightmare. His troops dressed as Ottomans to sow confusion. They poisoned wells, burned crops, and released infected animals into enemy camps. At night, Vlad led raids so brutal that Ottoman soldiers believed the devil himself was hunting them. One survivor wrote that the Wallachians came like shadows and vanished like smoke. Then came the moment that sealed his name in history. As the Ottoman army approached Targovist, Mehmed's scouts reported something strange ahead, a strange glimmer in the darkness. When the Sultan's army arrived, they found the source, a vast plain covered in impaled corpses stretching for miles. 20,000 bodies, soldiers, captives, even civilians, arranged in patterns like a macabre city of the dead. Each stake held its victim at a different height, so their heads formed a grim skyline. The scene was so horrific that Mehmed himself, hardened by decades of conquest, ordered a retreat. His chroniclers later wrote that even the Sultan was struck with wonder and said that a man who can do such things is not of this world. That moment became legend, the Forest of the Impaled. It wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Vlad knew he could never defeat the Ottoman army by force, but he could break their spirit. And he did. The invaders fled, leaving Wallachia in shock and awe. But victory came at a price. The same terror that saved his land also isolated him. Other Christian rulers began to see him as too dangerous, too unstable. The church, which had once praised his defense against the Ottomans, started whispering that he was possessed. The Pope himself called his methods satanic justice. Yet even as Europe recoiled, the story spread. Stories that would soon transform a real prince into a mythical monster. After the Forest of the Impaled, Vlad Tepes became both a savior and a curse. The Ottomans feared him, the peasants obeyed him, but the nobles and neighboring Christian rulers began to whisper that he had become something worse than the enemy he fought. They said the devil himself had found a throne in Wallachia. And in truth, something inside Vlad had broken. The horrors he unleashed to protect his land had begun to consume him. His rule turned inward, his paranoia sharpening like the blade of a stake. He no longer saw loyalty or treachery, only potential betrayal. Courtiers vanished overnight. Messengers who brought bad news were never seen again. Even minor offenses could end in impalement. A servant who spilled wine, a soldier who coughed during prayer, a woman accused of adultery. His cruelty was not random, but ritualized. He chose his victims with precision, ensuring that each execution carried meaning, a moral lesson carved in flesh. He impaled women for infidelity, merchants for greed, monks for hypocrisy. Sometimes he forced families to dine beneath the bodies of their relatives, watching as crows picked at their flesh. He believed he was cleansing the world through terror, that his brutality was a divine instrument of order. But outside Wallachia, the stories took on a darker tone. German pamphlets, some printed by his political enemies, began circulating tales of unimaginable horror. They described a prince who dined among the dying, who soaked his bread in human blood, who roasted children and forced their parents to eat them. Whether true or not, these accounts spread like wildfire across Europe. One chronicler claimed that Vlad impaled over 100,000 people during his lifetime, an impossible number, but one that captured the essence of his legend. To Western Europe, he became the embodiment of Eastern savagery, a half-Christian, half-demon ruler from a cursed land. To the Orthodox faithful, he was a martyr who defended Christendom when no one else dared. In 1462, his greatest betrayal arrived from within. After repelling the Ottoman invasion, Vlad sought support from his supposed ally, the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus. But Matthias saw opportunity in his downfall. Using forged letters that painted Vlad as a traitor plotting with the Turks, he arrested the Wallachian prince and imprisoned him in Hungary. For 12 long years, the Impaler sat in a dungeon, chained, forgotten, a man whose terror had turned into a ghost story. Yet even in captivity, he haunted Europe. Travelers swore they heard screams from his cell. One guard claimed Vlad impaled mice on wooden splinters just to pass the time. The Hungarian court kept him alive as a political pawn, trotting him out when it suited their cause. Eventually, after more than a decade in chains, Vlad was released, older, thinner, but no less dangerous. He returned to Wallachia for one final reign. The land he found was unrecognizable. The nobles he once ruled were gone, the villages burned, and his younger brother Radu, the same brother who had once shared his childhood captivity, now ruled as a vassal of the Ottomans. Vlad's return was met not with cheers, but with silence. The people had learned that his protection came at a terrible cost. Still, he raised his banner once more. The dragon emblem of his father's order flew again above Targovist. He waged war against invaders, against rivals, against the ghosts of his own legend. And for a brief moment, it seemed the old terror would rise again. But this time, his enemies were ready. In December 1476, Vlad rode into battle against an Ottoman-backed army. The details are lost to history. Some say he was betrayed by his own men, others that he fell fighting surrounded by enemies. What is certain is that his death was as brutal as his life. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to the Sultan as proof of his demise. The rest of his body was left to rot on the battlefield. His skull was displayed on a spike in Constantinople, the final irony for the man who had defined himself through impalement. But death did not end his reign. It only made it immortal. The stories that had spread during his life now evolved into something darker. In the decades that followed, his name, Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, began to merge with folklore of the undead. The same villages that had once feared his wrath now whispered that he had risen again, drinking the blood of sinners, wandering the night in his black armor. To the peasants, it made sense. How else could they explain a man who defied death so many times, who killed like a demon but claimed to serve God? He had ruled through blood. Now they believed he lived through it. After Vlad's death, his story refused to stay buried. The peasants of Wallachia whispered that he had not died at all, that his body had vanished from a battlefield, that he still rode through the forests at night on a black horse with flaming eyes. Some claimed they saw him drinking from skulls in ruined monasteries, others that he prowled the graveyards in search of sinners. It wasn't history anymore. It was haunting. The church didn't help. Local priests, terrified of his legend, declared that Vlad's body must have been carried off by demons. They warned that his soul could never rest because he had spilled too much blood. To stop him from rising again, they ordered that his remains, if ever found, be decapitated, burned, and the ashes scattered into running water. In Eastern Europe, that was the ritual for vampires. And that word, vampire, began to drift westward around the same time the first printed accounts of Vlad's cruelty reached Germany and Italy. Pamphlets depicted him surrounded by forests of stakes, raising a goblet of blood, laughing as the bodies of his enemies writhed around him. The illustrations were crude but powerful. His hooked nose, his pointed beard, his sharp eyes, the face that would one day become Dracula. Yet the transformation from man to monster wasn't instant. For nearly 4 centuries, Vlad Tepes was remembered primarily as a cruel ruler, a mad tyrant, a cautionary tale of power and paranoia. But folklore works like a slow fever. Over time, the old pagan stories of revenants, corpses that rose from the grave to drink the living, began to fuse with the memory of the Impaler. By the 18th century, Europe was in the grip of a vampire panic. Reports of the undead spread across the Balkans and Hungary, and scholars began to write treatises trying to prove or disprove their existence. And there, buried among those chronicles, the name Dracula appeared again. In Romanian, Dracula meant son of the dragon, taken from his father's Order of the Dragon. But in the language of common folk, Drac also meant devil. Over generations, the word's meaning shifted, and so Vlad, the son of the dragon, became Vlad the son of the devil. His symbol of holy war became a mark of damnation. Western travelers visiting Transylvania in the 18th and 19th centuries recorded the superstitions of the locals, how they drove stakes through corpses, burned hearts, or tied the dead with iron chains so they couldn't rise again. Many of these stories referenced a voivode Dracula, a ruler whose cruelty condemned him to walk forever between life and death. The legend had outlived the man. Then came 1897 and Bram Stoker. The Irish writer never set foot in Transylvania, yet he built his entire novel around its dark reputation. He found the name Dracula in old history books that mentioned a Wallachian prince notorious for impalement. Stoker didn't know the full truth of Vlad's reign, but he didn't need to. The fragments were enough. The cruelty, the forest of corpses, the devilish title. He turned it into myth. His Dracula wasn't a nationalist warrior or a tragic ruler. He was something colder, immortal, seductive, the embodiment of corruption hidden beneath nobility. And through him, the real Vlad was reborn, stripped of history, and turned into nightmare. But if you look closely, traces of the real man still linger inside the fiction. Stoker's count lives in a decaying castle high in the Carpathians, just like Vlad's fortress at Poenary, perched above a gorge so steep it could only be reached by hundreds of stone steps. The count drinks blood, but Vlad spilled rivers of it. The count commands loyalty through hypnosis. Vlad did it through terror. The immortal creature who haunts London's fog is nothing more than the echo of a prince who haunted Europe with fear. And yet, the irony is cruel. In life, Vlad Tepes saw himself as a defender of faith, a shield between Christendom and the Muslim world. He fought to preserve his people's land, their religion, their freedom. But history, written by his enemies, turned him into the devil himself. The Turks remembered him as a butcher. The Germans painted him as a sadist. The church called him unholy. And the world, centuries later, called him Dracula. Centuries after Vlad the Impaler's death, his shadow still lingered over the land he once ruled. His castles stood in ruins. His name whispered more as a curse than a memory. But in the 20th century, the world tried to dig him up again, literally. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating the monastery of Snagov, north of Bucharest, claimed to have found his grave. Local legend said Vlad had built the monastery himself on an island, and that he wanted to be buried there far from enemies, surrounded by holy ground and water. When the tomb was opened, the workers held their breath. The inscription bore his family crest, the dragon, and for a moment it seemed history would finally meet its ghost. But when they pried open the stone lid, the coffin was empty. No bones, no armor, nothing but dust. The body of Vlad Tepes had vanished. Some said the Ottomans had stolen his corpse. Others claimed his followers secretly moved it to prevent desecration. But among locals, a darker story took hold. The grave was empty because he had risen. They said the prince who impaled thousands would not stay buried. that even the ground refused him. The mystery only deepened when another supposed grave was discovered decades later in Naples, Italy, in a forgotten crypt beneath a medieval church. The coffin bore a faded carving of a dragon, and inside lay a skeleton wearing armor marked with Eastern motifs. Some historians speculated that Vlad's daughter had married into Italian nobility and brought her father's remains with her. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Yet photographs of the skull, sharp features, long canines, fueled the myth all over again. Vlad the Impaler, it seemed, would never rest in peace. But perhaps that's fitting, because the truth about Vlad isn't buried in any tomb. It lives in the uneasy space between hero and monster. To the Romanians who still honor him, he was a patriot, a man who stood alone against empires and refused to bow. To his enemies, he was evil incarnate. To the church, a sinner damned by his own brutality. And to the rest of the world, through the distorted mirror of fiction, he became the most famous vampire in history. What makes him endure isn't just the blood or the stakes, it's the contradiction. The man who fought under the banner of the cross, but ruled through impalement. The ruler who claimed divine justice, but turned his kingdom into a graveyard. The defender of Christendom who became its devil. In modern Romania, you can still visit the ruins of his castle. The path winds through the misty forests of the Carpathians, steep and narrow. The air feels heavy, as if the trees themselves remember. At the summit, you reach the remains of Poenari Fortress, a scatter of stone walls clinging to the cliffside. The wind whistles through the cracks like a low moan. Locals say if you visit at dusk, when the sun bleeds over the mountains, you can almost hear the faint creak of wood, the echo of stakes swaying in the wind. For centuries, writers, priests, and travelers tried to make sense of Vlad Tepes. Was he a monster? Or was he what his time demanded, a man who became cruel, so that others could live? Perhaps he understood something dark about power that others pretended to ignore, that fear governs men more efficiently than love ever could. Bram Stoker's Dracula may have immortalized him as a supernatural predator, but the real Vlad was something more chilling, human. A man of flesh and fury who believed terror could purify the world. A prince who carved order out of chaos, not with reason, but with stakes. And, in a way, the world has never stopped feeding on that story. Every generation resurrects him in books, in films, in nightmares, because deep down we recognize what he represents. The thin line between justice and cruelty, between faith and madness, between the savior and the monster. When you peel away the centuries of myth, what remains isn't a vampire hiding in a coffin. It's a man staring back at us from the mirror of history. A man who discovered that the surest way to make people remember your name is to make them afraid to forget it. The forest of the impaled may be gone, but its shadow still stretches across time. You can see it in every story that glorifies violence for the sake of order, in every ruler who believes fear is the purest form of loyalty. Vlad's empire of stakes rotted long ago, but his philosophy endures. Because what truly makes him immortal isn't the blood he spilled or the myths that followed. It's the part of humanity that still finds power in terror. And maybe that's the real horror behind Dracula. Not that he drank blood, but that he showed us how easily we could.